The British economy is in a dire situation. The cost of living is rising, life becomes unbearable, and the government can't fill the budget, which is why a lot of people started throwing the idea of introducing the wealth tax. At the end of the day, the top 10% of British people own 50% of the entire wealth, while the bottom 50% owns almost nothing. So you can't force these people to pay more taxes, but you can always tax the rich in order to fill the budget of the government. But what if I told you that a wealth tax isn't going to solve any problem? In fact, the wealth tax is going to destroy the British economy, and it's not just the rich people will become poor, but everyone else will become significantly poor and the entire government can collapse. If you think that I'm exaggerating, let me explain. There are two fundamental problems. On one side, the cost of living is rising dramatically, and that is true. Over the last 3 years alone, the cost of living has risen by 20%, and that's not including 2024 to 2025. If you also include that, then the prices have risen so much that people can barely make it to the ends meet. And if you look at the CPI reports, then it has been rising between 7 to 8% over the last couple of years, and inflation right now is about 3.7%. Prices on services has risen even faster than that at 5.7%. On the other side, if you look at the government's budget, you see that there is a deficit of £137 billion, which means that the government is spending way more than it's receiving in taxes, which is why it's going through a crisis. However, if you look at the people who are actually paying taxes, you will be amazed that the top 1% of British households are paying literally a third of all the taxes in the country. So the top 1% is literally paying most of the taxes in the country. And if you also include the top 10% of all the British households, suddenly you find out that they pay 60% of the entire taxes. However, the bottom 50% are paying less than 10% of the entire budget. In other words, rich people are financing the entire government. The top 10% of the British households are paying for the government to function. If you remove the top 10% and how much taxes are contributing to the country, then the bottom 50% are not going to survive. And now you want to tax them more? I would understand that by taxing them more is going to solve the problem. But here is why that is a horrible idea. You first have to understand how money is basically made, and there are two ways to do that. On one side, people get a fixed income or any kind of income, and that's how most people generate their money. You have your job, you go to your job, and every week or every month you're getting paid a fixed income. You can also make an income from a business. That's what we call a dividend. That is pure cash getting from your job or a business directly into your pocket. And everybody pays taxes on that. The more money pours into your pocket, the more taxes you pay. If you are making $10,000 or £10,000 in this case, then you're not paying much in taxes. But if you are getting £1 million into your pocket every month or every year, then you're paying a lot of taxes. On the other side, there is a second way to make money, and that is wealth. Wealth isn't direct cash that gets into your pocket. It is what you own. It is the real assets that are under your name that appreciate in value over time. For example, you have your house. Now, the value of your house might have risen 2 times or 3 times, or might have tripled over the last couple of years. However, it doesn't mean that you got so much money into your pocket. You're still living in the exact same house, but the price of your house have gone from £300,000 to £1 million, and finally you're a millionaire. But did somebody pay you £1 million? No, it appreciated in value. Wealth is also land that is under your house. Wealth is also businesses, such as stocks that you own in the stock market. And most of the wealth in any country, including the United Kingdom, is either real estate or stocks in the stock market. And here's why wealth inequality has been rising so fast. It's not the fault of the rich people, but rather it's the fault of the government. Since 2008, the government of the UK and most of the Western governments have been keeping very low interest rates. It was just recently that they have risen the interest rates when inflation got out of control. When you lower down interest rates, the cost of borrowing money becomes very cheap and everybody starts borrowing money. That increases the supply of money or any currency in the economy, which devalues the value of the currency, which devalues the value of the pound in this case. And if somebody on the other side has a house, his house is going to be adjusted to the real or the new supply of money within the economy. So the price of that house is going to rise. So it's not the fault that that person has bought a house, but it's the government dropped down the interest rates and devalued the value of the currency. On the other side, the government has been massively borrowing money. This is the balance sheet of the Bank of England. And whenever the Bank of England increases its balance sheet, it means that it is buying government bonds from the government of the UK, which means that it's directly printing the money and directly increasing the supply of the pound in the economy. In 2008, when the global economy collapsed, including the British economy massively increased the amount of pounds in the economy. And since then, it has been growing tremendously. Do you see a very clear trend between very low interest rates and the government massively borrowing money and increasing the supply of the money? And I want you to pay attention to the blue line because that is the real supply of money. That is the balance sheet of the Bank of England. And in 2020, again, the same thing happened. The Bank of England started buying massively all the government bonds from the British government, which allowed the British government to raise as much money as they wanted, which devalued the value of the pound. So what we had at the end of the day is that if you are in a fixed income and if you have a job, your employer is not obligated by law to raise your income if the pound gets devalued. That's not the job of your employer. Your employer is going to offer a price for that job, and it's your job or it's your responsibility or your choice to accept that job or not. On the other side, when you increase the supply of money within the economy, everybody understands that the value of the pound has dropped, but this house still holds the exact same value, which means that its price is going to rise to adjust the new supply of money within the economy, which is why the price of that house increases. So if you want to know the problem isn't that the rich people are very greedy and bad people. Yes, they might be greedy. Yes, they might be working super hard. Yes, they have made the right choice to take their money and buy assets that over time appreciated in value. But the real problem is that the cost of living is rising so much, or why most people cannot afford a house today, is because the government of the UK has been systematically devaluing the dollar through low interest rates and massively borrowing money that devalue your pounds so that you can afford a house in 2025. So you can't actually blame the rich people. You can't blame the wealthy people. It's not their fault that they have used their money to buy houses. I'm not saying that everything is fair. I'm not saying that everybody made their money in the right way. But if you give it a very general perspective, it's the fault of the government. And now let's imagine that we are going to impose a wealth tax of 10%. Let's say that we've got a problem. It doesn't matter who caused the problem. Will a wealth tax solve the problem? Let's assume that we are going to put a 10% wealth tax on any wealth that is above $1 million. That makes sense. It's just an example, just to give you a hypothetical example of how the system would work. So on one side, you have people who bought houses. Imagine somebody who bought a house 20 years ago for £300,000 or £500,000. Now, 20 years later, because the government has been devaluing the value of the pound, the price of that house has been increasing and it tripled, and now it's worth £1.5 million. So is it the fault of this person who's been living in this house for 20 years that the value of his house has grown to £1.5 million? And now, if we want this guy to pay a 10% tax on the value of his wealth, then he has to sell that house in the first place in order for him to have the cash to pay it. You can't be paying a portion of your house to the government. You have to liquidate your assets first. Now he has to sell his house simply because the government has been printing so much money. Ask yourself the question, is it fair to this person? Maybe this is a 70-year-old guy who's been living in that house for the last 30 years. Is it fair to him? Well, let's assume that we're going to do it anyways. And we will have to do this on the entire country, which means that everybody with a net worth of over $1 million will have to sell their assets. Because you have to understand that wealth and income are two completely different things. Cash is not real wealth. Most rich people don't have much cash. Most of their wealth is either being tied in the real estate market with houses, or it is in stocks in the stock market. So those people don't have a lot of cash. Now these guys, all of these rich people with a net worth of over $1 million are going to sell their house in the market. There will be an oversupply of houses in the market and not much demand on the other side. Now the value of these houses are going to drop. Now, this house no longer worth 1.5 million pounds. Now it's worth maybe 900,000 pounds. Does he still have to pay a wealth tax? Well, maybe not. So taxing people just because they have wealth is insanely stupid and it's not going to work. Let's say that it's going to drop from 1.5 million to 1.1 million. Now, will he pay a wealth tax on 100,000 pounds or he will pay a wealth tax on 500,000 pounds? And we're forcing people to sell their houses to move to cheaper houses, which makes absolutely no sense or whatsoever. On the other side, if we do the exact same thing with people who have a lot of stocks, you have to understand that most of the wealth is in the stock market because the stock market is where the truly wealth concentrated in because that's where the businesses are. So imagine you have a rich person who holds 10% of a business that's worth $1 billion. So 10% of that is $100 million. And now he has to pay a wealth tax on 99 million pounds. In order for him to pay that much taxes, he has to sell those stocks in the first place. Now, the reason that this company is valued at $1 billion is because in the open market, in the free market, based on the demand and supply for this business is valued at $1 billion. If we force this guy to sell his stocks in order to pay the wealth tax, suddenly he will be selling his stocks. There will be an oversupply of his stocks because he's forced to sell the stocks and not much demand on the other side, which means that the value of his stocks are going to drop. It's no longer worth $1 billion, the business. So his net worth is no longer $100 million. Maybe it will fall by 10%, 20%. Now his wealth is not longer $100 million, but rather $50 million or 60 million pounds or 40 million pounds. How much taxes should he pay? 10% on 100 million or 10% on a 50 million because that's what the market says right now. But the real question is that who is going to buy all of these stocks that are being sold suddenly in the open market? Imagine a 10% of wealth tax is being introduced tomorrow and all these rich people have to sell their assets to pay that 10% wealth tax. Then there is an oversupply of all of these assets in the market, but nobody to buy them on the other side because we're forcing all rich people to sell their assets to pay the wealth tax. The poor people don't have the money to buy that. Who is going to buy all of these assets for them to liquidate their assets to be able to pay that tax? Well, there is nobody in the United Kingdom. How about the people outside the UK? So basically what you're trying to do is that you are trying to force the rich people in Britain to sell their assets at a huge discount to foreign people to pay the wealth tax. Is that really fair for the rich people in the UK? That doesn't make sense. You're basically just destroying the lives of the rich people just because they're rich and you're making foreign rich people richer. Do you think anybody would want to live in the UK after that? Don't you think that wealthy people are going to flee UK in massive scale if something like that is ever going to be introduced? And that's why any form of wealth tax is not going to work. It's not going to raise any kind of money and you can't be doing that continuously. You might do that sometimes or once or twice and you might raise some real money, but that's a one-time offer and you will literally just destroy the entire economy. So the real question is that if a wealth tax is not going to work, what is going to be a real solution? Now, let's divide the society into two categories. On one side, we have the rich people. On the other side, we have the poor people. The first and the most important thing that we have to understand is that the goal should never be to make rich people poor like everyone else. The goal should be that to make the poor people rich like everyone else. And a wealth tax, all what it does is that it just makes the rich people poor like everyone else and let's all be together poor. Will that solve anything? Of course not. And that's why, how about we think how we can make the poor people richer? Now, the first and the most important thing that we can do is that let's stop devaluing the currency. Let's stop devaluing the pound. Let's stop systematically keeping low interest rates and printing so much money. Let's put a cap on how much the government can borrow money. Because any time that you see that the government is massively borrowing money, you have to understand that the poor people just got poorer. If you pass laws that the government cannot print money or borrow as much money beyond a certain threshold, then you're going to solve the problem in that way. Look at the debt to GDP ratio of the UK. You see that in 2008, the debt to GDP ratio literally doubled overnight in a single year. And then in 2020, the same thing happened. The debt to GDP ratio has risen to about 100% or more than that. And that's why today the British government has to pay £116 billion in interest to service its debts. And that's 10% of the entire budget. If these debt interest payments wouldn't be here, then the government wouldn't have a deficit in its whole. The government wouldn't have a problem to raise money to fill the deficit. So it's not literally the fault of the rich people that the entire government is being mismanaged, or the government is being run by people who don't understand anything about economics or business, and they're literally just ripping off the poor people. And now you want to punish the rich people because the government has mismanaged the entire country. Does that make sense to you or anybody else? The best solution is what Warren Buffett once suggested, that let's pass a law that whenever the government is going to go above a certain threshold in debt to GDP ratio, then these people no longer can run the country, and there must be immediate re-election, and these people no longer can run for the office. And they will do everything possible to keep the balanced budget, and they won't be forced to borrow so much money and devalue the local currency. But let's be honest, that's not going to happen. Nobody is going to let that happen. And that's why the only feasible option or solution in this case is for you to take care of yourself. Instead of relying on a fixed income, how about you take your fixed income and you start investing it wisely in the right assets? Yes, maybe the British stock market hasn't been growing that much, but the US stock market is growing tremendously, and that's where the real opportunities are. I know that for a lot of people who haven't been in the market for a long time, they don't have a proper strategy, they don't know how to get into the market, they don't have a step-by-step plan that they can follow to build a portfolio that will get them to financial freedom, and will put them on that path where every time the government prints money, their assets keep appreciating in value. Well, if you want a step-by-step strategy, you can find it out using the link in the description of this video. I have laid down everything for you, and you can find it just by checking the link in the description of this video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.